To a beautiful evening.
And to good company.
Hear, hear.
Je voudrais que vous déplaciez les hydrangeas macrophyllivers, le quitte est du jardin, près des roses Nevada. Et que vous taliez les buxus, sempervirens, infâmes, des spiro, des vendredi. Vivian Ashworth Cole delivered the instruction in rapid, deliberately ornate French, standing on the terrace of her 11-acre estate with 4 guests beside her, women in tailored linen and wide-brimmed hats, holding champagne flutes that caught the afternoon light, and she said it the way a person says something meant to be overheard rather than understood. The man she was speaking to stood a few feet below the terrace steps, work gloves tucked into his back pocket, soil still under his fingernails from the morning's planting, wearing the plain canvas overalls that marked him, to Vivian and her guests, as simply the gardener. His name was Etienne Laurent, though almost none of the estate's regular visitors had ever bothered to ask. "I do hope he manages to work that out," Vivian said to her guests in English, not quite under her breath, the corner of her mouth lifting into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's rather sweet, honestly. He nods along to everything regardless of whether he understands a word." The guests laughed, softly, politely, the specific laughter of people enjoying a joke they hadn't been entirely sure was appropriate but had decided to find funny anyway. Vivian had done this before, not with French specifically every time, but with whatever ornamentation suited the occasion, a small performance of superiority dressed up as instruction, delivered to a man she'd employed for 14 months and had never once asked a personal question. Etienne stood quietly for a moment, looking not at Vivian but at the hydrangeas she'd gestured to, as though genuinely considering the horticultural merit of the request rather than the insult wrapped around it. Then he answered her, in French, fluent, unhurried, precisely correct French, with the specific cadence of someone who had not merely learned the language but had spent decades speaking it as a professional. "Madame," he said, "les hydrangea macrophylla preferent un seul légèrement aside, etuna. Exposition miam. Le quitte est de votre jardin, recueillit, un plein, soleil, la presmidi, à cette période de l'année, ce qui, brolera, les figues, d'ici la mige, G suggerait plaidet, le quitte nord près du mort des pierres. Oh, le humidite du sol, est, mieux régulé." The terrace went silent, in the specific way a terrace goes silent when 4 women in wide-brimmed hats simultaneously realize they have deeply misjudged a situation. However, neither Vivian nor any of her guests had the faintest idea that the man in canvas overalls, standing below the terrace steps, had once served as head horticulturist at one of the most prestigious botanical gardens in Provence, and that the small, quiet humiliation Vivian had just delivered in front of her friends was about to become the most expensive joke she had ever made. Laurent had spent 22 years building a career that culminated in overseeing the entire botanical collection at the Jardin Botanique de Rousseau, a position that had required not only a doctorate in horticultural science but a level of fluency in botanical Latin, French regional dialects, and formal academic French that few gardeners anywhere in the world ever achieved. He had lectured at university symposiums. He had published research on soil acidity management that horticulturists still cited a decade later. He had been, by every measure that mattered in his field, exceptional. He had also, 6 years earlier, made the decision to leave all of it behind, not from any failure, but because his elderly mother, living in a rural village 2 hours from the botanical garden, had begun needing daily care that no facility nearby could adequately provide. He had resigned his position, moved to be near her, and eventually, after her death, found himself in an entirely different country, taking work wherever it paid steadily and asked no questions about a resume that would have otherwise seemed wildly overqualified for pruning hedges into spirals. He had never mentioned any of this to Vivian. She had never asked, "You speak French?" Vivian said, and it came out less as an observation than as an accusation, as though he had committed some minor deception simply by possessing a skill she hadn't bothered to imagine he might have. "Oui, Madame," Etienne said, switching back to English now, his tone entirely even, entirely without triumph. "For 22 years, professionally, I apologize if my accent from the Vaucluse region is a bit old-fashioned for your taste." One of the guests, a woman named Cordelia who had been visibly enjoying Vivian's earlier joke rather more than the others, now looked distinctly like she wished to be anywhere else on the estate. "I don't understand," Vivian said, recovering some of her composure, though not all of it. "Why would someone with your background be working as a—" She stopped herself, apparently even she recognizing, mid-sentence, that finishing it would only make things considerably worse. "As a gardener," Etienne finished for her, without any visible resentment, "because the work is honest, and because I happen to genuinely enjoy it, Madame. A doctorate does not change the fact that I like having soil under my fingernails. It also doesn't change the fact that your hydrangeas will die on the east wall by July, regardless of how the instruction was delivered." The silence that followed lasted long enough for one of the guests to quietly set her champagne flute down on the terrace railing, as though the conversation had become too uncomfortable to hold a drink through. To her credit, and it was a credit she would reflect on for some time afterward, did not attempt to salvage the moment with further condescension. She simply stood there for a long moment, processing the specific, uncomfortable arithmetic of having spent 14 months treating a man with 2 decades of specialized expertise as an object of casual entertainment for her garden parties. "I owe you an apology," she said finally, quietly enough that it didn't carry to the guests still lingering awkwardly near the railing. Rather, a significant one. "I think what happened over the following months was not a dramatic reversal so much as a slow, genuine recalibration." Vivian asked Etienne, for the first time in 14 months, actual questions about his work, not performative ones designed for an audience, but real questions about soil composition and root systems and the specific reasoning behind decisions he'd been quietly making on her property the entire time without anyone bothering to ask why. She raised his wages substantially, not as an apology dressed up as generosity, but because she'd finally understood what she'd actually been paying for and had been paying considerably below its value. More significantly, she began introducing him properly to her guests by name, by title, occasionally even mentioning his doctorate, which he found more embarrassing than the alternative, but tolerated for her sake. The east wall hydrangeas were moved to the north side, near the stone wall, exactly as he'd recommended. They bloomed spectacularly that July. Etienne still tends Vivienne's gardens today, though the relationship between them has shifted into something closer to genuine professional respect than employer and hired hand. Vivienne tells the story herself now, at those same garden parties, though considerably less proudly than she once told the joke that started it. "I spent 14 months, she says, assuming the man who knew my garden better than I ever would simply didn't understand what I was saying to him. It turned out he understood every word. He simply chose, for 14 months, not to embarrass me by correcting me sooner than I needed to be corrected." If you believe that the people we quietly underestimate are often carrying entire lifetimes of expertise we never bothered to ask about, please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Tales, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that dignity and knowledge rarely announce themselves through a uniform.